I remember the exact moment everything changed. My mother-in-law was laughing. Not the polite kind of laugh people make at family dinners. It was the sharp, cutting kind, the kind meant to remind you that you don't belong. Danielle leaned back in her chair, swirling the wine in her glass while everyone else at the table watched her. "You'll never be like Nicole," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "That girl actually knows how to build a future." The room went quiet. Brandon stared at his plate. Kayla smirked slightly but quickly hid it behind her napkin. And I sat there, feeling the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. For 4 years, I had tried to earn Danielle's approval. 4 years of smiling through comments like that. 4 years of pretending I didn't notice how often she mentioned Nicole, the woman Brandon used to date before we met. But that night was different. Because Danielle thought she knew everything. She thought she knew who I was. She thought she knew what Brandon had been doing. And she definitely thought I was still the woman who would sit quietly and swallow the humiliation. What she didn't know was that I had spent the past 2 weeks uncovering a secret so big it would shatter the entire family. A secret worth $750,000. And before that dinner was over, every single person at that table was going to hear the truth. My name is Jennifer. I was 34 years old that night. And on paper, my life looked almost perfect. I was the marketing director at a fast-growing tech company in Seattle, a job I had worked toward for more than a decade. I had my own team, my own office, and the kind of career that kept my calendar packed months in advance. Brandon liked to joke that I lived inside spreadsheets and strategy meetings, but he also used to say he admired my independence. Brandon and I had been married for 4 years. He was 37. A software engineer who worked remotely for a cybersecurity firm. Most days he sat at his desk upstairs, coding for hours while drinking the strongest coffee imaginable. From the outside, we looked like one of those couples people quietly envy. We owned a beautiful house in a quiet suburb just outside Seattle. On weekends we went hiking in the Cascades or drove to the coast. Sometimes we flew to California for long weekends when work allowed it. Our friends often said we seemed balanced. Stable. Happy. I believed that too. At least, I did until recently. There was only one place where that illusion always cracked slightly: Brandon's family dinners. Danielle lived about 40 minutes away in a large house she had owned since Brandon was a teenager. After his father passed away years earlier, she had become the center of the family's social gravity. Every few weeks, Brandon insisted we visit. And every time we did, I felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Danielle never openly insulted me at first. Instead, she specialized in something much subtler. Comparison. "Oh, Nicole just closed another property downtown," she would say casually during dinner. Or, "Nicole always had such ambition. That girl really understood how to make money." The first time she said something like that, I assumed she was simply reminiscing about Brandon's past relationship. But the comments never stopped. Sometimes she spoke about Nicole as if she were still part of the family. Sometimes she even said things that made me feel like an inconvenient replacement. Brandon always brushed it off. "She doesn't mean it like that," he would whisper to me later in the car. "She's just nostalgic." But nostalgia doesn't usually sound like criticism. And it definitely doesn't feel like humiliation. Danielle wasn't the only one who made those dinners uncomfortable. Brandon's younger sister, Kayla, often joined us as well. She was 32 and worked as a human resources specialist for a large logistics company. Kayla was the kind of person who smiled a lot but rarely said anything sincere. She and Danielle shared the same habit of bringing Nicole into conversations whenever possible. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself families could be complicated. I told myself Brandon loved me. And that was what mattered. And for years, I managed to convince myself that those dinners were simply awkward traditions. Then, about a year ago, something changed. Brandon started talking about money. One evening, he sat down beside me on the couch with a worried expression I had never seen before. "My mom's struggling a bit financially," he said. "Retirement didn't go the way she planned." He explained that Danielle had unexpected expenses and was trying to adjust to living on a fixed income. Then he mentioned Kayla. She's still paying off her student loans? He added. Things have been tight for her, too. Brandon wasn't asking for money directly. Not exactly. But he suggested that we might need to help his family for a while. At the time, the request didn't seem unreasonable. We both earned good salaries. Our finances were stable. Helping family during a difficult moment felt like the right thing to do. So I agreed. Over the next several months, Brandon handled most of the transfers himself. He told me how much Danielle needed for certain bills, or how Kayla needed help covering some expenses. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. And yet, over time, small things started to feel strange. Danielle never looked like someone struggling financially. Her house remained perfectly maintained. She continued hosting dinners with expensive wine and elaborate meals. Kayla, who supposedly couldn't manage her loan payments, showed up one evening driving a brand new SUV. When I mentioned these things to Brandon, he always had an explanation. Bonuses, temporary help from friends, refinancing. The answers sounded logical enough. Still, a quiet voice somewhere in the back of my mind began whispering that something wasn't adding up. I tried to ignore that voice, but it refused to go away. The first time I truly felt something was wrong, it happened during another one of Danielle's dinners. It was a Sunday evening in early spring. The kind of evening when the sky over Seattle turns soft gray and the air smells faintly of rain. Brandon and I arrived a little late because I had been stuck finishing a marketing report for work. And by the time we stepped into Danielle's house, Kayla was already sitting at the table scrolling through her phone. Danielle greeted us with her usual polite smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Jennifer, she said, giving me a brief hug that felt more like an obligation than affection. I was starting to think work was more important than family. I forced a smile. It ran a little late today. Brandon disappeared into the kitchen to help bring out dinner while I sat down across from Kayla. She barely looked up from her phone. A few minutes later, Danielle carried a tray of roasted chicken to the table and placed it down with dramatic care. Dinner started normally enough. Kayla talked about a new policy at her company. Brandon mentioned a software project he was working on. Danielle asked me a few polite questions about my job. Then, as usual, Nicole's name appeared. You know, Danielle said casually while pouring wine into Brandon's glass. I heard Nicole just sold another luxury property downtown. She said the name slowly, almost like she expected everyone at the table to admire it. Kayla immediately looked up. Really? That's impressive, she said. Danielle nodded proudly. That girl always knew how to move ahead. Some people just have that instinct. Her eyes flickered briefly toward me. I had learned not to react. Instead, I focused on my plate and took a slow bite of chicken. But Danielle wasn't finished. She used to tell Brandon that real success comes from thinking bigger than your comfort zone. She continued. I always admired that about her. The implication hung in the air. Brandon shifted in his chair. Mom? He said quietly. Can we not do this tonight? Danielle lifted her eyebrows as if she were surprised. Oh, please, she replied. I'm just complimenting someone's work ethic. Kayla gave a small laugh. I mean, Nicole always was pretty ambitious. I looked down at my fork. 4 years of marriage had taught me how to survive these moments. Responding only made them worse. Silence, I had learned, was the safest defense. The rest of dinner continued with the same strange rhythm. Danielle talked about people's careers. Kayla talked about buying a new gym membership. Brandon tried to change the subject whenever Nicole's name came up. But something about the conversation that night felt different. Not the comments themselves. The confidence behind them. Danielle didn't sound like someone reminiscing about the past. She sounded like someone who knew something. After dinner, Brandon went upstairs with Kayla to help her look at something on her laptop. Danielle stayed in the kitchen while I helped clear the dishes. We worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Danielle spoke. You know, she said casually, rinsing a wine glass. Nicole always had a very practical mind. I didn't respond. She understood opportunities. Danielle continued. Some people just see them. She turned toward me. You're very hardworking, Jennifer. No one can deny that. Her tone suggested that what came next would cancel the compliment. But sometimes hard work isn't enough. Sometimes you need the right instincts. I placed a plate in the dishwasher carefully. Instincts for what? I asked. Danielle smiled faintly. For success. I dried my hands with a towel and turned toward her. I think success means different things to different people. Her smile widened slightly. Yes, she said. It certainly does. Before I could respond, Kayla's voice echoed from the hallway upstairs. Mom. Danielle glanced toward the stairs. What is it? Kayla leaned over the railing. Can you come up here for a second? Danielle walked past me without another word. I stayed in the kitchen for a moment longer before quietly moving toward the hallway. Their voices drifted down from the second floor. At first I wasn't trying to listen, but then I heard a name. Nicole. I froze halfway up the staircase. Kayla was speaking. I'm telling you. She couldn't have closed that deal without Brandon helping her, Kayla said. Danielle's voice followed. Well, obviously, that house was way above her price range before. Kayla laughed softly. Still, it worked out perfectly. Nicole's going to make a fortune flipping it. My heart began beating faster. Danielle lowered her voice slightly. Just make sure Jennifer doesn't start asking questions. There was a pause. Kayla snorted. She won't. Brandon would never let that happen. My hand tightened around the banister. For a moment I stood there, completely still, trying to understand what I had just heard. Nicole. Brandon helping her. And Danielle worried that I might ask questions. I slowly stepped back down the stairs before anyone could see me. By the time Danielle and Kayla returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, I was standing by the counter pretending to scroll through my phone. Everything okay? Danielle asked. Yes, I said calmly. We said our goodbyes shortly after that. The drive home was quiet. Brandon kept the radio on low while the city lights passed outside the car windows. I watched the reflection of his face in the windshield. For the first time in our entire marriage, I wondered if the man sitting beside me might be hiding something big, and that quiet voice in the back of my mind, the one I had been ignoring for months, suddenly became impossible to silence. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood what I heard. People say strange things in private conversations. Sometimes words sound different when you only catch fragments of them. Maybe Kayla was exaggerating. Maybe Brandon had only helped Nicole with some professional advice. Maybe Danielle was just being dramatic again. But the more I replayed the conversation in my mind, the less believable those explanations felt. Nicole's name had come up too easily, too comfortably. And Danielle's words, make sure Jennifer doesn't start asking questions, echoed louder every time I thought about them. The following week, I started paying closer attention. Not in an obvious way. I didn't confront Brandon. I didn't ask suspicious questions. I simply watched. Brandon had always been careful with money. That was one of the reasons I trusted him with most of our finances. He managed the investment accounts and handled the majority of our bank transfers. I focused on my work and trusted that he was doing the responsible thing. Now I began noticing small details that had never seemed important before. One evening after dinner, Brandon sat on the couch with his laptop open, typing quickly. I walked into the living room carrying a mug of tea. What are you working on? I asked casually. Just some coding stuff, he replied without looking up. I sat down beside him. His screen tilted slightly away from me. It was such a small movement that anyone else might have missed it. But I noticed. Another night. His phone buzzed repeatedly while we were watching a movie. Brandon glanced at the screen and quickly flipped the phone face down on the coffee table. Work messages, he said when he saw me looking. That answer might have satisfied me a month earlier. Now it felt rehearsed. A few days later, I logged into our shared bank account to review some household expenses. It was something I did occasionally, mostly to keep track of mortgage payments and monthly bills. The numbers immediately caught my attention. There were several transfers I didn't recognize. They weren't small. $5,000, $10,000? Another $8,000 a few weeks later. Each transfer had been labeled with vague descriptions like consulting or personal transfer. My first instinct was to assume they were related to Brandon helping his family. But something about the frequency felt strange. Danielle had said she was struggling financially. Kayla had mentioned student loans. But these amounts seemed far larger than what someone would need for simple bills. That evening I brought it up casually while we were making dinner. I was looking at the account earlier, I said while chopping vegetables. There were some bigger transfers recently. Is everything okay with your mom? Brandon paused for half a second. Just long enough for me to notice. Yeah, he said quickly. It's been a rough few months for her. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet. Some medical stuff came up. Nothing serious. But insurance didn't cover everything. His explanation sounded reasonable. Almost too reasonable. How much did she need? I asked. Not that much, he said. I'm just helping where I can. I nodded slowly. That conversation should have ended my curiosity. But instead, it made the uneasy feeling inside me grow stronger. Over the next week, the pattern continued. Brandon started keeping his phone closer than usual. If it buzzed, he picked it up immediately. If he left the room, the phone went with him. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to get water. As I walked past his office, I noticed light coming from under the door. Brandon was inside, typing. When I pushed the door open slightly, he closed his laptop almost instantly. Just finishing something for work, he said. I smiled and nodded, pretending I believed him. But by then I had stopped believing anything. The final moment that pushed me from suspicion into certainty came during another family dinner. This time the topic wasn't Nicole. It was Kayla's new car. We were sitting at Danielle's table again when Kayla casually mentioned that she had just upgraded her SUV. Danielle clapped her hands with excitement. Oh, it's gorgeous, she said. You should have seen it when she drove up earlier. I looked at Kayla. A new SUV? I asked. That must have been expensive. Kayla shrugged. It was a good deal. Danielle poured more wine. Kayla deserves it, she said proudly. She works hard. I tried to keep my voice neutral. I thought you were still paying off your student loans. Kayla froze for a fraction of a second. Then she laughed. Yeah. Well, things change. Across the table. Brandon avoided my eyes. In that moment, something inside me shifted. All the little pieces, the strange transfers, the secretive phone calls, the conversation I overheard suddenly started forming a picture I could no longer ignore. And that quiet voice in the back of my mind finally spoke clearly. Something was very wrong. And whatever Brandon had been hiding, it was bigger than I had imagined. That night, as we drove home through the dark Seattle streets, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. First, I was going to find out the truth. Every single piece of it. The night I finally decided to look at Brandon's laptop. The house was unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The kind of steady Seattle rain that could last for hours. Brandon had left that afternoon for what he called a 2-day work trip to Portland. He kissed my cheek before leaving. Promised he'd call when he arrived. And drove away without the slightest sign that anything in our marriage had changed. But the moment his car disappeared down the street, the silence in the house felt different. For the first time in 4 years, I realized how little I actually knew about what my husband did when I wasn't around. I spent most of the evening pacing between the kitchen and the living room, trying to decide whether I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. Looking through someone's private computer wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing. But neither was discovering that my husband might be hiding financial secrets connected to another woman. Around 9 o'clock, I walked upstairs. Brandon's office door stood slightly open. His laptop sat exactly where he had left it earlier that morning, closed neatly on the desk beside a half-empty coffee mug. I stood in the doorway for almost a full minute. Then I walked inside. The chair creaked slightly as I sat down. I opened the laptop. The login screen appeared instantly. Password required? For a moment I almost laughed. Of course there was a password. Brandon had always been careful about security. Being a software engineer for a cybersecurity company meant he took digital protection seriously, which meant guessing his password might be impossible. Still, I tried the obvious ones first. Our wedding date. Incorrect. His birthday. Incorrect. The name of our dog from years ago. Incorrect. After the fourth failed attempt, I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I was letting paranoia ruin a marriage that had been perfectly stable for years. But then I remembered Danielle's voice. Make sure Jennifer doesn't start asking questions. My fingers returned to the keyboard. I tried a different approach. Brandon loved using variations of simple words combined with numbers. It was something I had noticed years earlier when helping him set up a streaming account. His favorite hiking trail. Incorrect. The name of his college. Incorrect. Then a thought crossed my mind that made my stomach tighten. Nicole. I hesitated. Then I typed her name. Nicole 32. Incorrect. Nicole Seattle. Incorrect. I exhaled slowly. Then I remembered something Danielle had said once during dinner. She had mentioned the year Brandon and Nicole first met. I typed again. Nicole 2016. The screen changed. For a moment I didn't breathe. The desktop appeared. My heart started pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I hadn't expected it to work. But it had. I stared at the screen for several seconds, suddenly aware that I had just crossed the boundary between suspicion and truth. Now there was no going back. The desktop looked ordinary at first glance. Folders labeled work projects, documents, finance, emails. I clicked on the finance folder. Several spreadsheets appeared instantly. Most of them were labeled with normal things, investment summaries, monthly budgets, tax planning documents. Then one file caught my attention. Transfers_overview. XLSX. The name was oddly specific. I opened it. The spreadsheet expanded across the screen in rows and columns. Dates. Amounts. Account numbers. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed a column labeled recipient. And next to nearly every transfer was the same name. Nicole. My hands went cold. I scrolled down. $5,000. $10,000. $15,000. Another $12,000. Each row listed a date and a short note beside it. Investment help. Property down payment. Bridge loan. The numbers continued down the page for months. January. February. March. April. My breathing became shallow as I reached the bottom of the spreadsheet. At the very end was a total. $750. 000. $750,000. For a moment I thought I must be reading it wrong. But the numbers didn't change no matter how many times I blinked. Over the past year, Brandon had transferred $750,000 to Nicole. My husband. The man who told me he was helping his mother pay bills. The man who told me his sister needed support with student loans. I stared at the screen, trying to process what that number meant. $750,000 wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. A deliberate choice repeated again and again over 12 months. And suddenly, Danielle's comments at dinner made perfect sense. Nicole's successful real estate deals. Nicole's sudden ability to flip luxury properties. Nicole's mysterious rise in the market. None of it had come from talent alone. It had come from Brandon. My hands trembled slightly as I opened another file. This one contained email records. Dozens of messages between Brandon and Nicole. Some were about real estate investments. Some were about money transfers. And some were very clearly not professional. One message from Brandon stood out immediately. Once everything settles down, we won't have to hide anymore. My chest tightened. There were other emails too. Emails that made the betrayal even worse. Messages between Brandon and Danielle. And Danielle and Kayla? They weren't asking questions. They weren't confused. They knew exactly what Brandon had been doing. One email from Danielle read, "Just make sure Jennifer never sees the transfers." Another from Kayla said, "She trusts you too much to look." I sat there in Brandon's chair, staring at the screen, while the rain continued tapping softly against the windows outside. For 4 years I had tried to become part of that family. I had smiled through their comparisons. I had helped financially when they claimed they needed it. And the entire time they had been watching my husband build another woman's life with our money. But as the shock slowly faded, something else replaced it. Not panic, not sadness, something colder. If Brandon believed I would never see the transfers, then he had made a very serious mistake. I didn't confront Brandon the next day, or the day after that. Instead, I started preparing. The morning after discovering the spreadsheet, I woke up earlier than usual. The house still felt heavy with the knowledge I now carried. Brandon texted around 8 saying he had arrived safely in Portland and would be in meetings most of the day. I replied with a simple message. Glad you made it safely. Then I set my phone down and walked back into his office. The laptop was still open exactly where I had left it the night before. For a moment I stared at the screen again, half expecting the evidence to disappear, as if it had only been some cruel misunderstanding. But the spreadsheet was still there. $750,000. Nicole's name repeating line after line. My hands were steadier now. If Brandon had spent an entire year hiding this, I couldn't afford to act emotionally. I needed to think carefully, so I started copying everything. First, the spreadsheet itself. I downloaded the file onto a flash drive I kept in my desk drawer. Then I created duplicate screenshots of every page, making sure the dates and totals were clearly visible. Next, I opened the email folder again. There were dozens of messages between Brandon and Nicole. Some discussed property deals and real estate investments. Others were far more personal. I didn't read every word. I didn't need to. The tone alone made it obvious what kind of relationship they had. More importantly, several messages referenced money transfers. One email from Nicole read, "Thank you again for helping with the down payment. I couldn't have done this without you." Another from Brandon said, "This is an investment in our future." I felt something twist inside my chest when I read those words. Our future. Not my future. Not our marriage. His future with her. I copied every message that mentioned money. Then I moved on to the emails involving Danielle and Kayla. Those were even worse. In one message, Danielle wrote, "Nicole will go much further than Jennifer ever could." Kayla responded minutes later, "At least Brandon is finally helping the right person." I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing myself to stay calm. Anger would only cloud my judgment. And right now, judgment was the most valuable thing I had. After copying the emails, I moved to the bank records stored on Brandon's computer. Each transfer listed an account number connected to Nicole's real estate business. The transactions were spread across the entire year. Some were small, $5,000, $10,000. Others were enormous, $50,000, $70,000. Each payment had been carefully labeled to look legitimate. Consulting, investment assistance, temporary loan. But the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet didn't lie. $750,000. When I finished copying everything, I removed the flash drive and placed it carefully in my purse. Then I closed the laptop and left the office exactly the way I had found it. No trace. No sign that I had ever been there. Later that afternoon, I made a phone call. The person I contacted was someone I trusted professionally, an attorney I had worked with briefly during a marketing contract dispute a few years earlier. Her name was Laura. We arranged to meet the next morning at her office downtown. When I arrived, the rain was falling harder than usual, blurring the city skyline outside her window. Laura greeted me warmly but quickly noticed my serious expression. "Jennifer," she said, sitting across from me at the conference table. "What's going on?" I opened my purse and placed the flash drive in front of her. "I need you to look at something." For the next 20 minutes, Laura reviewed the files on her computer. The spreadsheet, the bank transfers, the emails. Her expression gradually changed from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. $750,000, she said quietly. I nodded. "And this all came from your joint marital accounts?" "Yes." Laura folded her hands together. That's significant. What does that mean legally? I asked. She considered the question carefully. If these records are accurate, she said, your husband has been using shared marital assets to financially support another person. I stared at the table. That's what it looks like. Laura nodded slowly. In most states, that could absolutely matter during a divorce settlement. The word divorce felt strange in the room. Not shocking. Just real. So this could be used as evidence? I asked. Very strong evidence, Laura replied. Especially if the money was transferred without your knowledge. I exhaled slowly. And his family? I asked. They knew. Laura glanced at the email messages again. If they were aware and encouraged it, that could make things even worse for him. Silence settled between us for a moment. Finally, Laura looked directly at me. The real question is what you want to do. I already knew the answer. But I didn't say it immediately. Instead, I thought about Danielle's voice. Nicole's name at every dinner. The quiet laughter across the table. And the email where Kayla wrote that Brandon was finally helping the right person. I looked up at Laura. They think I'm stupid, I said quietly. Laura didn't respond. They think I'll never find out. I pushed the flash drive toward her. But I don't want to confront him yet. Laura raised an eyebrow. What are you planning? I stood up slowly. Brandon's family has a dinner scheduled next week, I said. The usual monthly gathering. Laura watched me carefully. And for the first time since discovering the truth, a small, controlled smile appeared on my face. I think, I said, that would be the perfect place to tell everyone exactly where the money went. For the next week, I behaved exactly like the wife Brandon expected. I cooked dinner. I asked about his work. I laughed at the same jokes I had heard 100 times before. If he noticed anything different about me, he never said it. Inside, however, everything had changed. Every time Brandon kissed my cheek before leaving for work, I thought about the spreadsheet. Every time he mentioned helping his family, I remembered the emails between him, Danielle, and Kayla. And every night before going to bed, I reviewed the evidence again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to make sure I was prepared. Laura had helped me organize everything into a clean, simple folder on my laptop. Bank transfers, email messages, the spreadsheet showing the total, $750,000. Each file was clearly labeled. Easy to explain, impossible to deny. Laura had also given me one very important piece of advice. Don't confront him privately, she said during our second meeting. Why? I asked. Because people lie when they think they still have control of the story, she replied. But when the truth appears in front of witnesses, the lies collapse much faster. Her words stayed with me, which is why I waited. The family dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening. The same house, the same table, the same people who had spent an entire year believing I would never discover the truth. By Thursday evening, Brandon seemed unusually relaxed. We were sitting on the couch watching television when he mentioned it casually. Mom called today, he said. Oh, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She's excited about Saturday. She's making that roast she likes. I nodded. That sounds nice. Brandon stretched his arms over his head. It's been a while since we've had everyone together. I studied his face quietly. There was no sign of guilt. No hint that he was hiding something worth $750,000. Just the same calm expression I had trusted for 4 years. Nicole might actually come by later, he added suddenly. My heart skipped for half a second. Really? I asked. Yeah, he said quickly. She's been helping Mom with some property stuff. Real estate advice. The lie was so casual it almost impressed me. I forced a small smile. That's helpful of her. Brandon nodded. Yeah, she's good at what she does. I didn't respond, because now I knew exactly how good she was. Friday night arrived quietly. Brandon ordered takeout and we ate dinner in front of the television. At one point he reached over and squeezed my hand. I know things have been busy lately, he said. But I'm glad we still make time for each other." The words felt almost surreal. I looked at him and wondered if he had ever meant them, or if everything about our marriage had simply been convenient. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open. The evidence folder glowed softly on the screen. I checked it again. Every document, every email, every bank transfer. Then I opened the spreadsheet one more time. $750,000. Even seeing the number again still felt unreal. But the plan was clear now. Tomorrow night, Brandon's family would gather around the same dining table where Danielle had spent years comparing me to Nicole. Tomorrow night, she would probably mention Nicole again. And when she did, I would be ready. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully into my bag. Saturday morning arrived with bright sunlight breaking through the clouds. Seattle looked almost peaceful. Brandon seemed to be in an especially good mood. He made coffee for both of us and hummed quietly while getting dressed. "You ready for tonight?" he asked while tying his shoes. "Of course," I said. He smiled. "Mom's been asking about you." I almost laughed. "Has she?" "Yeah," he said. "She worries you feel uncomfortable around her." The irony of that statement was almost overwhelming. But I simply nodded. "I'm sure everything will be fine." In the afternoon, I spent an hour preparing myself, not emotionally, strategically. I reviewed the files once more and made sure my laptop battery was fully charged. I practiced exactly how I would connect it to Danielle's television. Most importantly, I rehearsed what I would say. Not angry, not dramatic, just clear, because the truth didn't need decoration. It only needed to be seen. By the time evening arrived, I felt calm. Strangely calm. Brandon grabbed his keys around 6. "Ready?" he asked. I picked up my bag. Inside it was the laptop containing everything he had tried to hide. "Ready?" I said. The drive to Danielle's house felt shorter than usual. When we arrived, the lights inside were already glowing warmly. Kayla's new SUV sat in the driveway. Through the window, I could see Danielle moving around the kitchen. Everything looked exactly the same as every other family dinner we had attended. Brandon opened the front door without knocking. "Hey, Mom," he called out. Danielle appeared in the hallway with a bright smile. "There you are," she said happily. Then she looked at me. For a brief moment, her expression shifted into the familiar, polite smile I had seen so many times before. "Jennifer," she said. I smiled back. And for the first time since joining that family, I knew something she didn't. Tonight, the story they had been telling themselves for a year was about to end. Danielle's house smelled like rosemary and roasted garlic when we stepped inside. The warm scent drifted through the hallway and into the living room, just like it did at every family dinner. Kayla's laughter echoed faintly from the kitchen, while Danielle moved between the stove and the dining table with practiced energy. Everything looked exactly the same as every other time we had been there. That was the strange part. Nothing in the room suggested that the entire family had been hiding a secret for the past year. Danielle walked toward us with open arms. "Brandon," she said happily, hugging him first. Then she turned toward me. "Jennifer," she said with a polite smile. "It's good to see you." Her voice carried the same faint distance it always had. I returned the smile. "It's good to see you too." Kayla appeared in the doorway holding a wine glass. "Well, look who finally made it," she said. She gave Brandon a quick hug before turning to me. Her expression was friendly, but her eyes studied me carefully, as if she were checking whether I had changed in some way. "Hi, Jennifer," she said. "Hi, Kayla." The greetings ended there. Brandon immediately walked toward the kitchen to help Danielle finish dinner, leaving me standing awkwardly near the dining table. Kayla leaned against the counter. "So how's work?" she asked casually. "Busy," I replied. That marketing world never slows down. Does it? I shook my head. "Not really." Kayla nodded as if she understood, though I knew she probably didn't care. For a moment the room fell into a quiet rhythm of cooking sounds. Danielle stirred something in a pan while Brandon opened a bottle of wine. Then Danielle spoke again. You know, she said lightly. Nicole was here earlier this week. The name landed in the room like a small stone dropping into water. Brandon stiffened slightly near the counter. Kayla glanced at him before looking back at me. Oh, really? I said calmly. Danielle nodded. Yes. She stopped by to discuss a property she's been working on. Her tone carried the same quiet admiration I had heard so many times before. That girl is doing very well for herself. Danielle continued. Her real estate business is expanding quickly. Kayla smiled. She's always been good at spotting opportunities. I felt Brandon's eyes briefly flick toward me. I kept my expression neutral. That's impressive, I said. Danielle studied my face for a moment, as if searching for a reaction. When she didn't find one, she simply nodded and returned to the stove. Dinner was ready a few minutes later. We gathered around the same dining table we had used dozens of times before. Brandon sat beside me. Danielle took her usual seat at the head of the table, and Kayla sat across from us. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed harmless. Work. Weather. A movie Kayla had recently seen. But the tension under the surface was impossible for me to ignore. Because now every smile, every casual remark, carried a different meaning. Every person at that table knew the truth except the woman they believed was the easiest to fool. Danielle lifted her wine glass halfway through dinner. I have to say, she began, it's always interesting to watch how different people build their lives. Kayla nodded immediately. Some people move forward quickly, she added. Danielle smiled slightly. And others take a more cautious approach. Her eyes drifted toward me. I took a slow sip of water. Brandon shifted in his seat. Mom, he said quietly, maybe we should talk about something else. Danielle raised her eyebrows. Oh, Brandon. I'm just making conversation. She turned toward me again. You know, Jennifer. Nicole always had such strong instincts about success. There it was again. The comparison, the subtle implication that I had heard so many times before. Kayla leaned back in her chair. She always knew how to think bigger, she said. Danielle nodded approvingly. That's exactly it. She placed her fork down and looked directly at me. Nicole understands how to create opportunities. Then she smiled. I suppose that's something not everyone learns. The room grew quiet. For a moment, no one moved. Brandon stared down at his plate. Kayla watched me carefully. Danielle waited. It was the same pattern they had repeated for years. Danielle would make the comparison. Kayla would support it. Brandon would remain silent. And I would politely endure it. Except this time. Something inside me felt different. For the first time since joining that family, I wasn't trying to earn Danielle's approval. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Because now I understood the truth. Nicole's success hadn't come from talent. It had come from my husband's bank account. Danielle picked up her wine glass again. You know, she continued thoughtfully. If Brandon had stayed with Nicole, I sometimes wonder how different his life might have been. Brandon looked up quickly. Mom, but Danielle raised a hand. Oh, relax. I'm just speaking honestly. Kayla laughed softly. Well, she's not wrong. The words hung in the air. I felt Brandon glance toward me, clearly worried about how I might react. But instead of anger, a strange calm settled over me, because Danielle had just given me exactly what I needed. The perfect moment. I placed my fork down on the table. Then I slowly pushed my chair back. The sound of the chair sliding against the floor made everyone look up. Brandon frowned. Jennifer. I stood up. Danielle tilted her head slightly. Clearly curious? Yes, she asked. For the first time all evening, I looked directly at her. If you admire Nicole so much, I said calmly, maybe you should ask her to return the $750,000 Brandon spent on her this year. The words landed in the center of the table like an explosion. No one spoke. Danielle's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Kayla's smile vanished instantly, and Brandon turned pale. For several seconds after I spoke, no one moved. The entire room seemed to freeze. Danielle's wine glass hovered halfway between the table and her lips. Kayla stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking another language. Brandon's face lost what little color it had left. The silence stretched long enough to feel heavy. Then Danielle laughed. It wasn't nervous. It was dismissive. "Oh, Jennifer," she said, setting her glass down slowly. "That's a very strange joke." Kayla let out a small chuckle, clearly relieved. "Yeah," she added, glancing at Brandon. "What are you talking about?" Brandon looked at me carefully. "Trying to read my expression?" "Jennifer," he said quietly. "Where is this coming from?" I remained standing beside my chair. "I'm not joking," I said. Danielle leaned back in her seat and folded her arms. "Well, that's good," she replied, "because what you just said makes absolutely no sense." Her tone carried the same condescending patience she used whenever she thought I was being dramatic. $750,000. She continued. "Brandon has never given Nicole anything like that." Kayla nodded immediately. "That's ridiculous." Brandon finally spoke again. "Jennifer," he said carefully, "if you're upset about something, we can talk about it later. The familiar strategy. Dismiss. Delay. Control the narrative. But the difference tonight was that I had brought the truth with me." I walked slowly toward the living room. "Where are you going?" Danielle asked. "Just a moment," I replied calmly. My bag sat on the couch exactly where I had placed it earlier. I opened it and removed my laptop. Behind me, I could hear Kayla whispering something to Brandon. When I returned to the dining room, all three of them were watching me. "What exactly are you doing?" Danielle asked. I placed the laptop on the small console table beside the television. "Clarifying something," I said. Brandon stood up quickly. "Jennifer, wait." But I had already opened the screen. The laptop woke instantly. Danielle frowned. "I don't understand what you think you're proving." "You will," I said. I picked up the HDMI cable connected to the television and plugged it into the laptop. The screen on the wall flickered. For a moment, it displayed nothing but the empty desktop background. Then I opened the spreadsheet. Rows of numbers appeared across the television screen. Dates. Transfers. Amounts. The name Nicole repeated again and again. Kayla's voice broke the silence first. "What is that?" she asked. Danielle leaned forward slightly. Brandon didn't say anything. I stepped aside so they could see the screen clearly. "It's a record of Brandon's bank transfers," I said. Danielle squinted at the television. "I don't see what that has to do with—" Her voice stopped abruptly, because she had just seen the name. Nicole. And the numbers beside it? 5,000. 10,000. 20,000. The rows continued down the screen. Kayla leaned forward in her chair. "Wait," she said quietly. I scrolled down slowly. Each movement of the screen revealed another line. Another transfer. Another payment. Danielle's expression changed. The confident smile she had worn all evening began to disappear. "That can't be right," she said softly. I kept scrolling. Then the bottom of the spreadsheet appeared. At the very end was the total. $750. 000. Kayla's face turned pale. Brandon still hadn't moved. Danielle looked from the television to her son. "Brandon," she said slowly. "What is this?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the screen. For the first time since I had spoken, Kayla looked genuinely nervous. "Is that real?" she asked. I turned toward Brandon. "You should probably explain," I said. Danielle's voice grew sharper. "Brandon," he rubbed a hand across his face. "It's not what it looks like." Kayla let out a short breath. "Then what does it look like?" Brandon looked at me, then back at the television. "I was helping her," he said finally. Danielle blinked. "Helping her how?" Brandon hesitated. "With investments," he said. Kayla stared at him. "Investments." I crossed my arms. $750,000 of investments. Brandon looked uncomfortable. "It wasn't all at once," he said defensively. Danielle's voice dropped. "You gave Nicole that money. It wasn't just giving," he insisted. "Some of it was loans." Kayla shook her head slowly. Brandon. Danielle stood up. You told us you were helping with a few things, she said. You never said anything about that amount. Brandon looked frustrated now. It's complicated. The room felt suddenly smaller. The truth that had been hidden for a year now filled every corner of it. I watched them carefully. Danielle looked shocked. Kayla looked terrified. And Brandon looked like a man realizing the story he had been telling everyone was collapsing. I took a step closer to the television. That's not the only file, I said quietly. All three of them turned toward me. I opened the email folder. The next document appeared on the screen. Messages between Brandon and Nicole. And messages between Brandon, Danielle, and Kayla. Danielle's face went completely still, because she had just seen her own words. The moment Danielle saw her own email on the television screen, the room changed completely. Her posture stiffened. Kayla leaned forward in her chair as if hoping she had misread the message. Brandon took one slow step back from the table, his eyes fixed on the screen. The email was simple. Danielle's name appeared clearly beside it. Just make sure Jennifer never sees the transfers. The words hung in the air like smoke. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Kayla whispered, almost to herself, "Oh my God." Danielle quickly turned toward me. "That email doesn't mean what you think it means." Her voice sounded sharper now. Defensive. I didn't respond. Instead, I clicked to the next message. Another email appeared on the screen. This one from Kayla. "She trusts you too much to look." Kayla's face went white. "Jennifer," she started, her voice trembling. But the explanation died in her throat, because the message was right there in front of everyone. Brandon finally stepped forward. "Turn that off," he said quietly. I didn't move. "Jennifer," he repeated more firmly. "Turn it off." No. The single word seemed to surprise him. For 4 years I had avoided confrontation with this family. I had smiled through their insults and ignored their comparisons. But that version of me was gone now. Danielle looked from the television back to her son. "Brandon," she said slowly, "what exactly is going on here?" He ran his hands through his hair. "It's not that simple." Kayla shook her head. "It looks pretty simple to me." I clicked open another email. This one was from Brandon to Nicole. "Once everything settles down, we won't have to hide anymore." Danielle's eyes widened. Kayla covered her mouth. For the first time all evening, Brandon looked directly at me with something close to anger. "You had no right to go through my computer." I let out a quiet breath. "You used our money to build another woman's life." "That's not what happened," he snapped. "Then explain it." The room fell silent again. Danielle's voice was quieter now. "Brandon, is this true?" He hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was enough. Kayla saw it. Danielle saw it. And I saw it. "Yes," he said finally. The word dropped heavily onto the table. Danielle blinked in disbelief. "You gave Nicole that money?" Brandon exhaled slowly. "I helped her get started with real estate." Kayla laughed in shock. $750,000 is not getting started. He looked frustrated. "She had opportunities she couldn't afford to take." "So you funded them?" Kayla asked. Brandon didn't answer. Danielle looked from him to the television again. "You told us she needed support," she said quietly. Brandon rubbed his temples. "I thought she could build something real." I stared at him. "And what about our marriage?" His gaze flickered toward me but quickly shifted away. "It's complicated." The answer felt almost surreal. Complicated? As if the past year had been some messy scheduling conflict instead of a carefully hidden betrayal. I took a slow step closer to the table. "Did you think I would never find out?" Brandon didn't respond. Kayla shook her head again, still stunned. "How long?" she asked. "A year," I said before Brandon could answer. Danielle looked horrified. "A year." I nodded toward the television. The transfers started last January. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, because now there were no more questions about whether the evidence was real, only the realization of how long the deception had lasted. Danielle slowly lowered herself back into her chair. I knew you were helping her, she said quietly to Brandon. But I didn't know it was this much. Kayla turned toward her. You knew. Danielle didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. I thought he was just giving her advice, she said finally. I didn't say anything. The emails on the screen told a different story. Kayla noticed them again too. You told him to make sure Jennifer never saw the transfers, she said. Danielle looked up quickly. That's not... It's right there. Kayla interrupted. The room began unraveling. The quiet alliance that had existed for a year was suddenly collapsing under its own weight. Brandon looked exhausted now. I didn't think it would get this far, he muttered. I almost laughed. You didn't think I would notice $750,000 disappearing. His eyes finally met mine. I was going to fix it. When... He didn't answer. The truth was obvious. There had never been a plan to fix it. Only a plan to keep hiding it. Danielle's voice broke the silence again. What were you planning to do with Nicole? Brandon hesitated. The hesitation was enough. Kayla leaned forward slowly. Were you planning to leave Jennifer? Brandon closed his eyes briefly. Yes. The word hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said that night. Yes. For a moment. No one seemed to know how to react. Kayla stared at her brother like she had never seen him before. Danielle's face drained of color as she slowly leaned back into her chair. Even Brandon seemed startled by his own honesty. But I wasn't surprised. Somewhere deep inside. I think I had already known. What did you just say? Danielle asked quietly. Brandon didn't look at her. I said yes. His voice was flat now, stripped of the careful excuses he had been trying to build earlier. Kayla blinked rapidly. You were planning to leave Jennifer. Brandon rubbed his forehead again. Eventually. The word sounded almost casual. Eventually. As if ending a marriage were something that could be scheduled between meetings. Danielle shook her head slowly. You told me you were helping Nicole with investments, she said. I was, Brandon replied. That's not the same thing as planning to marry her. He didn't answer. I stood beside the television, watching the entire scene unfold with a strange sense of distance. For 4 years, I had believed I was building a future with this man. Now I was watching him admit that he had been building a different one the entire time. With our money, I said quietly. Brandon finally looked at me. I was going to pay it back. The excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. How? I asked. He hesitated. I was planning to sell some investments once Nicole's properties started turning profit. Kayla let out a harsh laugh. So the plan was to gamble Jennifer's money on your girlfriend's real estate career. Brandon's jaw tightened. It wasn't a gamble. $750,000 says otherwise. Danielle turned toward him again, clearly struggling to process everything. You should have told me the truth, she said. Brandon looked frustrated. You already knew. I knew you were helping her. Danielle insisted. I didn't know you were throwing your entire marriage away. Kayla shook her head. You told him to keep it hidden from Jennifer. Danielle looked defensive. I didn't think it was that serious. Her eyes flickered toward me. Jennifer. I raised a hand gently. There's no need to explain. She fell silent. The truth was already sitting in the middle of the room. For a moment, no one spoke again. Then Brandon pushed his chair back and stood up. Look, he said, his voice tense. This isn't the way I wanted this to happen. I almost smiled. You mean you didn't plan on getting caught? His expression hardened. You went through my private files. You used our shared accounts. That doesn't give you the right to spy on me. Kayla stared at him. You're really going to argue about privacy right now. Brandon looked irritated. This is between me and Jennifer. That's funny, Kayla said. Because it sounds like you involved Nicole, Mom, and $500,000. $750,000. I corrected quietly. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. This is a disaster. Brandon looked around the room, clearly realizing how badly everything had unraveled. I was trying to build something better, he said. With Nicole. Yes. The honesty returned again. and somehow it hurt less this time. Maybe because I had already seen the evidence. Maybe because the man standing in front of me no longer looked like the person I had married. "What about our life?" I asked. Brandon's shoulders dropped slightly. "I thought you would understand eventually." The answer felt surreal. "You thought I would understand that you spent our money on another woman?" He didn't respond. Because there was no possible explanation that could make sense of that. Kayla leaned back in her chair. "I can't believe this." Danielle still looked stunned. "You told us Jennifer was helping the family," she said quietly. Brandon sighed. "I needed a reason for the transfers." I nodded slowly. "So my generosity was the cover story." He didn't deny it. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the television behind me. Then I reached for the laptop. The screen still displayed the spreadsheet. $750,000. I closed the file and shut the laptop. The sharp click echoed through the room. "I think we're done here," I said. Brandon looked confused. "What do you mean?" I placed the laptop back into my bag. "I mean, there's nothing else to discuss." Danielle looked up quickly. "Jennifer." I met her eyes calmly. "You said earlier that Nicole understands success." She didn't reply. "Well," I continued quietly. "Tonight she gained $750,000. My voice stayed steady. "And you all gained the truth." Brandon took a step toward me. "Jennifer." "Wait." But I was already turning toward the door. Because there was nothing left for me in that house. And for the first time all evening, the silence behind me felt like freedom. The night air outside Danielle's house felt colder than I expected. For a moment I stood on the front steps, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle around me. Behind me I could hear voices rising inside the house, Kayla arguing with Brandon, Danielle demanding explanations, but none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. I walked to the car and opened the door. Just as I was about to sit down, the front door behind me swung open. "Jennifer." "Wait." Brandon's voice echoed across the driveway. I paused but didn't turn around immediately. Footsteps hurried toward me. "Jennifer." "Please," he said again. I slowly turned. Brandon stood a few feet away, his face tense, his hair slightly disheveled as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. "Can we talk?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. "We just did." "No," he said quickly. "Not like that. Not in front of everyone." I leaned against the side of the car. "What exactly would be different in private?" He hesitated. "I could explain things better." "You already explained," I said calmly. "You planned to leave me." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you said." Brandon exhaled sharply. Everything got out of control. The sentence sounded almost desperate, as opposed to the carefully controlled plan you had before. I asked. He ran a hand across his face again. I didn't think it would blow up like this. The honesty of that statement almost made me laugh. "Of course you didn't," I said. He looked at me with a mixture of frustration and regret. "You went through my computer," he repeated again. "You spent our money. You embarrassed me in front of my entire family." I studied him quietly. "That's the part you're worried about." His jaw tightened. "You could have talked to me first. Would you have told me the truth?" Brandon didn't answer. The silence between us stretched long enough to become its own answer. I opened the car door slightly. "Jennifer," he said quickly, stepping closer. "We can still fix this." I stopped. "Fix what?" "Our marriage." The word sounded strangely empty now. "How exactly would that work?" I asked. He hesitated again. "I'll cut off contact with Nicole. You were planning to marry her. That was before tonight." The explanation sounded almost surreal. "So the plan changed because you got caught." He looked irritated. "That's not fair." "No," I said quietly. $750,000 wasn't fair. For a moment he said nothing. Then he tried a different approach. "You're overreacting." The sentence landed so strangely that I almost didn't process it at first. "Overreacting. You exposed everything in front of my family," he said. "You humiliated me." I stared at him. "You humiliated yourself." That's not the point. It actually is. His frustration was obvious now. You didn't have to make a scene. You spent a year lying to me, and now everyone thinks I'm some kind of villain. I took a slow breath. You are. The words came out calmly, without anger, and that seemed to bother him more than anything else. Jennifer, I trusted you. I continued. You trusted me too, he replied quickly. Yes, I said. That's how marriage usually works. He shook his head. You're acting like everything we had was fake. I looked at him carefully. I'm trying to figure out which parts were real. The driveway fell quiet again. Inside the house, I could still hear Danielle's voice arguing with Kayla. Brandon glanced toward the door briefly before looking back at me. We can work through this, he said. No, I replied. He blinked. No, I'm filing for divorce. The word hung in the air. For the first time since he had come outside. Brandon looked genuinely shocked. You're serious? Yes. You're just going to throw away 4 years. You threw them away already. His expression hardened. This doesn't have to end like this. It ended a long time ago, I said quietly. When you decided to invest in someone else's future, Brandon looked at the ground for a moment. You'll regret this. The threat sounded weak. I don't think so. He looked up again. You'll be alone. I almost smiled. I already was. The words seemed to land harder than anything else I had said that night. For a moment, Brandon looked like he might say something else. But nothing came out. I slid into the driver's seat. Goodbye. Brandon? He didn't move. The engine started with a quiet hum. As I pulled away from the house, the rearview mirror showed him still standing in the driveway under the porch light. A year earlier, that sight might have broken my heart. Tonight, it felt like closure. The next morning, the house felt different. Not quieter, just emptier. Brandon had stayed at Danielle's house that night. His car never appeared in the driveway. And for the first time since we bought the house together, I woke up alone in the bedroom. Sunlight pushed through the curtains, illuminating the room in a way that made everything look unfamiliar. The closet, the framed photos, the life we had built together. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, letting the reality of everything settle into place. There was no dramatic heartbreak, no shouting, no tears, just a strange, steady clarity. The truth had finally surfaced, and with it came a quiet understanding that the marriage I thought I had was never real in the way I believed. Later that morning, I called Laura. I'm ready. I told her, for what? She asked. To file. There was a short pause on the line. All right, she said calmly. We'll start the process today. Within a few hours, the paperwork began moving. Laura explained that the financial records I had collected would be extremely important. The transfers to Nicole were clearly documented and traced directly to our joint marital accounts. Brandon would have to explain every dollar. And more importantly, the court would have to decide how those losses were handled. $750,000 is not something a judge ignores. Laura told me. I thanked her and ended the call. For the rest of the day, I moved slowly through the house, packing a few personal things into boxes. Not everything, just what I needed for now. Clothes, documents, a few photographs from before Brandon had entered my life. By the afternoon, I signed a lease on a small apartment in downtown Seattle. It wasn't as large as the house, but it felt peaceful. The following weeks moved faster than I expected. Brandon called several times. I didn't answer. He sent messages, some angry, some apologetic, some desperate. I read them once and then stopped opening them. Danielle never contacted me again. Kayla sent a single message that simply said, I didn't know it was that bad. I didn't reply to that either. The legal process continued quietly in the background. Brandon's financial records were examined. Assets were reviewed. Investments were evaluated. Some of the properties Nicole had purchased began attracting attention once people started asking questions about where the funding came from. Real estate circles in Seattle were smaller than most people realized, and scandals traveled quickly. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Nicole's business started struggling once the story spread. Investors became cautious. Deals slowed down. Eventually, I stopped paying attention, because for the first time in a long while, my life was moving forward instead of standing still. Work became my focus again. At the office, no one knew about the chaos that had unfolded behind the scenes. To them, I was still the same marketing director managing campaigns and leading meetings. And I liked it that way. Normal felt good. A few months later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment overlooking the Seattle skyline. The city lights stretched across the horizon, reflecting softly off the water. For the first time since that night at Danielle's house, I allowed myself to think about everything that had happened. Brandon's betrayal, Danielle's quiet encouragement, Kayla's silence, $750,000 spent building someone else's life. For a long time, I believed revenge meant destroying the people who hurt you, making them suffer the way you suffered. But standing there that night, I realized something different. The most powerful revenge wasn't anger. It was truth. Truth removes masks. Truth ends lies. Truth forces people to face the consequences of their choices. I didn't need to ruin Brandon's life. He had already done that himself. All I had done was turn on the light. And once the truth is visible, there's no way to hide it again. If you've ever experienced betrayal like this, whether from a partner, a friend, or even family, you probably understand how complicated those moments can feel. Sometimes the hardest decision isn't exposing the truth. It's finding the strength to walk away from people who hoped you would stay silent. So I'm curious about something. If you had been sitting at that dinner table that night and discovered your partner had secretly spent $750,000 on someone else, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them privately? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, justice, and the moments when the truth finally comes out, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories begin exactly where the lies fall apart. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.